All right, Julie Behling. You are the author of Beneath Sheep's Clothing, and then you made a documentary somewhat recently about this. I guess floor is yours. Give a little bit of a intro and kind of what motivated you to do this, what the documentary is about, just kind of who you are, and we'll start there.
Yeah. So it's probably good to start with my background. Otherwise, people will ask, why would you write a book about that? So,
right.
I was a missionary in Russia in the late 90s, and I was there for a year and a half. And I came back to the U.S. and ended up going to graduate school and got a dual master's in Russian language and literature and Russian and East European studies. And then I ended up, writing my master's thesis on underground Christian movements in the Soviet Union and their survival tactics and the tactics of the Soviet state to try to dismantle Christianity. And what kind of got me into that is I had met some of these former underground Christians, just a few of them, when I was a missionary in Russia. And it was kind of shocking. It was amazing to meet these people and to see, like, they definitely stood out from the rest of the average Russian citizen. They're very different. And so, I really did a lot of my research when I was taking my Russian and Soviet history classes in grad school. I was very much geared towards culture. And I did a lot of research and different papers, researching culture, going back, hundreds of years, the development of the culture of the religious culture in Russia, and then going into the Soviet Union. And so I just kind of felt driven to write this thesis. And then I kind of felt like there was a greater purpose to it, that I was doing this research not just for my degree, but that there was going to be some purpose for it later. And then it was in 2008. So I defended my thesis in 2004. And then in 2008, there was something on the news that kind of caught my attention. It was an unpopular cult, as it's considered, and probably would fit that definition almost, a cult in America that had tanks. The Texas authorities pulled up with tanks and then forcibly took all the kids collectively from the group with no due process in order to, quote unquote, protect the children from abuse that might happen eventually, not abuse that was happening currently. And I was like, that's very similar to what the Soviets did. So I took a deeper look, and I saw that the three main tactics that I researched for my thesis for the Soviets to dismantle Christianity were happening in America, some of them for over a century. And so I began research and writing my book, Beneath Sheep's Clothing. I didn't publish it until 2022. And then the film came after. The film came out last summer, and that's a whole story in and of itself. How that happened.
Awesome. And so I guess piggybacking off of that, what are the main tactics in which the Soviets used to eradicate and dismantle Christianity from within, from a governmental level?
Yeah. So a lot of people are aware that, during the Bolshevik Revolution, they were just arresting clergy. They were torturing, executing, imprisoning, especially Russian Orthodox clergy and priests and nuns and monks. And it was a bloodbath. And then they by the end of World War II, and by the time Stalin died, they were like, we have to change our tactics because we're not eradicating Christianity. It's getting stronger, but it's in an area where we can't reach it. And also, the Soviet Union had more casualties than any other nation from World War II, and they were emerging from the Stalinist horrors. They were kind of a shattered nation in many ways after World War II, and so the government made the decision to change their anti-religious tactics. And those are the ones I focused on. They're a more sophisticated set of tactics. So they stopped just the wholesale persecution, arrest, torture of Christians. Didn't work. Well, it worked in some instances and then backfired greatly.
Right.
What they did is they kept those heavy-handed tactics only for the cults, the dissident Christians, the ones that did not go with the mainstream. In the Soviet Union, those were underground Baptists, Pentecostals, Seventh-day Adventists, and Jehovah's Witnesses. They were considered cults, and they still got the very heavy-handed, you're a Baptist choir master, we're going to arrest you and put you in the gulag for 5 years. you teach your kids to pray and you're in this underground Pentecostal church, we're going to take your kids forcibly, put them in a state-run boarding school / orphanage until they turn 18 so we can indoctrinate them into atheism. So they kept those tactics for those groups. And then the one tactic that was constant all the way through was propaganda. So the wholesale anti-religious propaganda and pro-communist, pro-socialist, pro-Soviet propaganda through every channel, through the education, through media, through the arts. And of course, the government was able to mostly control that. Then the third tactic is a new one they introduced after they stopped the wholesale persecution of Christians. It was infiltrate the churches to control them from within. And they did this by means of KGB agents that posed as clergy, they went into the seminaries as KGB agents. And then they went in and then were able to rise up quickly within the ranks of especially the Russian Orthodox Church, but also the registered Baptist Church and other churches. They also infiltrated the dissident churches, but they were harder to do. But even to the extent that when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1990, 1991, the patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church at that time himself was a KGB agent who had infiltrated years ago, like decades previous.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, you kind of, in some sense, see some similarities today within certain denominations. I'm sure you're familiar with a lot of the Big Eva stuff and a lot of I don't know how similar it is, and I'm sure it was far more sophisticated. I'm sure it's far more sophisticated today in some sense with technology and all of that. But yeah, you see this kind of infiltration of Christianity, because you're right, where Christianity, when there's this strong arm trying to oppress it from outside, it tends to have the opposite effect. You see that throughout church history, especially in the early church. Read the book of Acts, right? There's this heavy-handed persecution, and the church just expanding massively. And then you see this trajectory throughout the Roman Empire for the next several hundred years. You see this throughout the Middle Ages. You see this just consistently throughout church history. God has an interesting way of working in that way. But it's this infiltration from within that I'm curious about. Like, how did they actually, like, from what you've learned in the Soviet Union, how was that effective? Like, how did they actually get in undetected, in a sense? Or were they detected, or how sophisticated was it?
They were detected.
It
was common knowledge. It was upwards of 80% of clergy in the Soviet Union from like the 60s and on. Either they were KGB agents or they were collaborating in some way, shape, or form.
Interesting.
And
yeah,
even well-meaning priests, they would be just asked to, let's say, report on the goings on within the church. And if they wouldn't collaborate, they could be arrested and sent off to the Gulag. They also, the Soviets went into the Gulag and recruited priests and pastors who were there currently.
Yeah.
And hey, if you we'll let you out, we'll leave you and your family alone, we'll set you up in a nice apartment, give you a car. All you have to do is just report back to us what's happening in your church. So, it was even things like that. And so, you can see how even well-meaning people would be like, well, I could still at least preach the gospel. So it wasn't that they were all callous, evil people that were collaborating.
They were being coerced in one way or another, essentially.
Yeah, but then they're the ones, the KGB agents themselves, that their goal was to destroy the church. So, how does that translate to what happened in America? Well, it wasn't KGB agents, at least not that I know of. Well, you could argue that Black liberation theology is a KGB operation, but it was, you have to go back further. Who bankrolled a lot of this socialist / communist infiltration of institutions in America? I mean, there's lots of different angles, but one that I address in my book, and it's mentioned a little bit in the film Beneath Sheep's Clothing, is the robber barons of, the late 19th century, early 20th century, that they were taking over every institution. And you had the Rockefeller Foundation literally paying for avowed communists in some cases to go and to take up positions within seminaries. So they weren't just going into the seminaries to go into the churches. They were taking up positions of teaching in the seminaries, avowed communists. These are people who
Oh.
actually did not believe in Jesus. And they were
And so they would
evil.
lie to the seminaries about who they were essentially and their identity and what they believed to get a foothold in the door, or were they more explicit about it? Or
Some of
if
them
that
were
makes
pretty
sense.
openly.
Really?
Yeah. Yeah. It's actually it was one of the more shocking realizations I had during my research. So you had in some cases, you would have someone who's in there and the names, I don't want to butcher any of the names, and I haven't been going through this research in depth recently, but there was one guy who he was preaching from the pulpit, and this is also in the film, preaching from the pulpit at the Rockefeller Riverside Church in New York, where he was the lead pastor, that Jesus was not of a virgin birth. And so what they would do is they would cast doubt on the divinity of Jesus and make him more like a good person.
Yeah.
Then one of the big things that these infiltrators also did is they wanted to take Christianity in America away from the individual relationship one has with God and a reconciliation of sin, which is
Right.
kind of the main
That's
part
the
of
whole point.
Christianity. Yeah,
Yeah.
they wanted kind of push that off to the side and get rid of that as much as possible, and then focus everyone on social justice. And they started doing this like 1920s, 1930s, like a long time ago. And it's kind of an easy thing to do because Christians are supposed to be engaged in helping the underprivileged. So they can get the Christians only focused on social justice and get away from this individual relationship with God and this whole concept of sin. You had one of them teaching that that Jesus came not to redeem mankind from sin as we understand it, but from the 6 sins of social injustice. And this is like decades and decades ago. So to the point that by the mid 20th century, about half of America's mainline Christian denominations were very heavily infiltrated from the top down. And it wasn't that they were all avowed communists, but you have the avowed communists in the seminaries pushing them in this direction. So you have people who are duped, who are fellow travelers. Maybe they're not themselves full-fledged avowed communists that are preaching and that are, clergy in these churches. But the whole thing gets pushed further and further to the left, further and further away from the actual kernel of Christianity.
So, I mean, all the crazy leftism that we're seeing in churches today, I mean, even in very trusted institutions like the SBC, which I was once a part of, am not anymore for for a lot of these reasons. I mean, so just seeing how easily people were swayed into this, or how far it's gone in certain. I mean, you look at Methodists, or you look at all these different denominations. I mean, they have drag queens on stage sometimes. Like I just saw this clip from a church in Milwaukee where there's like this worship song they were singing, and they were literally saying dropping F-bombs in the worship song, talking about how they're free to do what they want. And it was really bizarre. I mean, so you see things like that. And if you're not familiar, I'm sure, with the history of how this is built, you're thinking, okay, how did we go from Jesus is Lord, preaching the gospel faithfully, to this? And it seems like it happened overnight, which, before I really started looking into this, that's what I thought. I was like, what in the world is it? I remember when I first started to see this in the SBC, I was like, these are the conservatives, I thought. What's going on? But now what you're saying is this has been a developing thing for, I don't know how many decades. Yeah, a century. And, but so how is this, if you're looking at the SBC today, are there still any key players that you could, or just any denomination that you can think of? Are there still any key players that you would identify as still playing into part of that op, you could say, that you should look out for? I don't know.
Yeah, and I'm not.
Is a good thing to do, but
well, and I'm not. I've never been Baptist, so I've never really focused on any of those people. But Tim Keller is a name I've heard dropped quite a lot as a questionable party. And look, there's good people in all of these different faiths. One thing I wanted to just go back and mention really quick. So one thing that people need to understand is that one of the main vehicles for all this infiltration into the churches in America, communist infiltration, was through the National Council of Churches. They were the ones, so all the denominations, which is, again, that's about half of the main line. That's where you have your Methodist, your Presbyterian, your Episcopalian,
Right.
and several others that are part of the National Council of Churches. And people were sounding the alarm bell for this. There's books written way back in the 50s, and like people were trying to sound the alarm bells, but no one was listening. Even I found in the 1960s, the National Council of Churches, this ecumenical organization, supposedly Christian organization, they were putting out pamphlets. They were like collaborating with Planned Parenthood. They were putting out pamphlets encouraging
Wow.
youth, like teenagers, to experiment sexually, and like as
Really?
a
Wow.
church organization. Yes, the biggest ecumenical organization putting out pamphlets encouraging young people. It's okay. Go ahead and sleep with your boyfriend, your girlfriend. You're a teenager. You're not married. Hey, it's really fine. It's okay. So really bizarre stuff. So yeah, the woke stuff we see in some of these really extreme cases, it didn't come out of nowhere. It was a slow growing cancer for almost a century before it became obvious to a lot of people. And then so I wrote, and I did most of that research for my book between 2009 and 2011. And like I wrote 80% of the book then, and then it just like couldn't be finished. So I had to set it aside. And I pulled it out in 2021. I pulled the manuscript out and I was like, I got to finish this now. And then I had to catch everything up to modern day. And so the whole woke revolution had happened in the meantime. And I was very disheartened when I learned that the evangelicals had also become infiltrated during that time, because they hadn't been when I initially did that research. They were still like, there was not significant infiltration amongst the evangelicals and like Southern Baptists. But I came across Trevor Loudon's work, and Enemies Within the Church is a documentary he did that goes into very in depth into that top down push in evangelical faiths in America. And yeah, it was very depressing for me to learn. So yeah, but that's just one aspect of the book. We go into education even more, the infiltration of education.
And I think it's kind of the same story with education, where you're seeing all this crazy woke stuff popping up over the last several years, especially. And to me, it seems like it's just the fruits of a tree that's been growing for a very long time. And
100%.
and so I guess kind of get into where did that tree start? Who first planted that tree, and kind of how it's developed?
Yeah. So when I initially wrote my book, I was trying to pinpoint when exactly, and I couldn't find an exact when. I found a when later on that I'll tell you about in a second. But I couldn't find that when. But what a big wave of it that was disturbing was actually, again, we're back to the Rockefeller Foundation, the Rockefeller Education Board, and their goals of turning America's children and the populace at large, not into well-educated, best selves of people that can go and do their best work in the world, but to be cogs in a machine that they themselves would be able to manage. That's important to understand about communism. The people who are pushing it and funding it, they're not doing it because they're communists. Communism is a way for them to amass and consolidate the most power possible in their hands and keep it out of the hands of the masses, all while under the guise of purportedly helping the masses. So it can be sold to the populace as a good thing. So Rockefellers were not communists. They were using communism to control and amass power. And so then you have like John Dewey, and you have this whole group of socialist educators and people kind of at the pinnacle of education in America. They were going and doing all these experiments. They went to China and they experimented on the populace. They found that they were really excited when they found that with their teaching techniques, they could completely, within less than a generation even, completely shift the cultural values of a society. And they did their research, some of the main schools of education that were hotbeds of all of this socialist garbage would be Columbia University and in Chicago, University of Chicago. Anyways,
Hmm.
they did their research, and where they were basically seeing education again not as a way to enlighten the minds of the populace, but to control, and using Pavlovian, essentially using stimulus and response to groom a populace in a certain way and groom their ideology as well. When I started doing the
Like
first interview,
trigger like a social reward system essentially
yes,
for
yes,
getting in line with what they want. Yeah.
yes,
Interesting.
yes. Yeah. So it wasn't until I did my first interview for the film Beneath Sheep's Clothing, I interviewed Alex Newman first, that he enlightened me further. And we have this in the film, how he has the receipts, apparently, that the actual genesis of government schools. Did you lose me there for a second?
For like 1 second, but it's a local recording, so it'll be good. But so keep going.
Okay. So Alex Newman makes the claim, and he has a book on it with the receipts, that the actual genesis of government-run schools in America was a man who was a communist, and his goal was to strip the populace, strip off the Christianity, and mold a whole new populace. And he couldn't get that to take off in America, but he found an audience in Prussia. And so the Prussian school system that many of us have heard of, that is the genesis of our government school system. But the genesis of the Prussian government school system was an American communist. But so it starts with this American communist, exports that over to Prussia. Prussia sets up their government schools, and then it's re-imported back into America. And you have Horace Mann, who was a big activist for getting the government to be in charge of the schools.
So this is the bedrock of the Department of Education, essentially, and what we're experiencing today. What would you say that started as kind of a communist play to subvert the population into a more humanistic, atheistic, communist worldview rather than a Christian one?
Are you talking about the Department of Education explicitly, or just this whole program of government schools?
Well, I don't know. I guess Department of Education specifically. But I'm sure that I don't know how much that ties together to what you're saying. But
well, I mean, because it developed for decades and decades before the Department of Education. I was like in kindergarten, I think, when the department, or preschool, when the Department of Education was founded.
So the Department of Education was offshoot of this development, essentially.
Well, it was a Jimmy Carter thing, and it did a lot more things that have pushed us in this direction. But it was still developing this whole time. And again, I think, and I mentioned this in my book, I have to, by no means do I think most teachers are, throughout, America's history, have been bad. The vast majority of teachers are well-intended, good people. I had many wonderful teachers when I was in school, but the whole system itself, even with me, I got a way better than average public education in America. I was still trained up to be a cog. I had to unlearn a whole bunch of things because I've been self-employed for most of my career, and I had to unlearn a lot of things that were drilled into me just by virtue of sitting in the public schoolroom for, however many, 16,000 hours of my childhood years. So even in a best case scenario, our education system does not groom us to take the bull by the horns and to be an agent unto ourselves with our career and what we do. But then on the worst case scenario, and they were doing experiments with this way back even in the 50s and 60s, where they were experimenting, like they were inserting in inner cities, they were inserting reading curricula for Black children in inner cities that was potentially inciting them to violence. Instead of like see Dick run, see Jane pet the dog, or whatever the case may be, it was like little rhymes of like showing, setting a house on fire, and like acts of like violence with the kids learning to read. And there was a huge outcry, and they had to stop that. But then all the experiments with getting rid of phonics out of our reading, you can't really teach reading. There are some people that you can teach reading to in English without phonics, but the majority of kids need the phonics to be able to really master reading. We have I don't know if you've ever learned another language. English is a really weird language. Like, it's so, if you're
I
not
have
teaching,
not, but I've heard, yeah, yeah,
I taught my son to read. My son is 10 years old now. And I was like, it was, and I taught many people to read. I taught Russian for 3 years when I was in grad school. So I taught many people, several dozen people to read in Russian. And then I'm teaching English, someone to read in English for the first time a few years ago. And I'm like, wow, this is so bizarre. So without the phonics, a lot of people are going to be messed up with their reading. And that's been done on purpose. There's lots of other different experiments and different things they did, even pretty far back. Um, One of the things, so when I first did my research on the Marxist infiltration of education in America, which again, Alex Newman wouldn't even call an infiltration. It was not Marxist, but communist from the beginning. I was looking at kind of like persecution of like Christians within the schools. Like there were cases of kids who like brought like a Bible to school to like read like in between classes, and like some of these kids were getting like expelled for even bringing a Bible to school. In some cases, they were not letting kids wear a cross in America's public
wow.
schools in, let's say,
And how far back
90s.
does that? Oh, you were just answering my
Like
question.
the 90s, early 2000s,
Yeah,
this was starting to be more and more of a thing. And not being able to, of course, taking the Christian holidays out of school is no longer, can you have a Christmas party? It has to be a holiday party, you know. Just all those various things, which the Soviets did that. They took, the Christian holidays and repurposed them into Soviet packages. And you can argue that Christians did the same thing with pagan holidays. You can argue that as well. But that is a tactic to be able to take over an ideology and a culture, is to get rid of the holidays of the ideology you don't
yeah,
like and make them your own, which I
right.
started saying in America.
Yeah. So, like, what are some hallmarks? Like when we talk about the Prussian education that was imported back here, communist education style. What is that style specifically, and how does it specifically train people to just be cogs in a wheel and to kind of forego their Christian heritage or Christian beliefs prior, if that makes sense? Like, how does that actually work? What is the mechanisms of that?
I don't know that I'm prepared to give you a 100% complete answer on that, but one of the hallmarks is the sitting at desks and the set time, and like every student is going to be learning the same thing and doing the same thing, and the teacher up at the front, and just the things that we associate with school in many cases, instead of more of a free form. I'll just give an example of my own schooling experience where I had a principal. He actually, I went to a lot of different schools. My dad was in the military and we moved a lot. One of the schools I went to in Texas, the principal won Principal of the Year for the state of Texas one of the years I was at that school. And they completely slashed the normal math instruction. The Prussian style, you could say, math instruction, of where the teacher's at the front, the kids all have to learn these concepts in this specific order. And too bad if you can't follow this specific thing, you're going to struggle. Oh, well, you just have to get with the program. They slashed that, and they completely revolutionized math instruction, where it wasn't even a math instructor. It was kids working at their level and then working more with a smaller group, and the teacher helping and coming to mentor. And so we had kids, were able to like be a couple grade levels ahead in math. And then the kids that needed more time to learn the basics had that as well. And it was perfectly fine.
Yeah.
People got a much
So,
better education.
I mean, I mean, that makes sense with when you think about communism, this idea of just radical egalitarianism. Everyone's the same. No differences allowed. And when you translate that to education, I mean, we see how that doesn't really work that well. I mean, how many kids struggle in school as a result? And then what do? We don't think about the the mode of education that we're taking on and how that's affecting each person, where we just say, oh, this kid must have fill in the blank mental disorder or learning disability, and then we drug them as a result, which that's a whole other conversation entirely. But you see how this plays out. But that's interesting how kind of doing away with because most people just think that's normal, that style of education. They don't even question it because this is what we've always done, allegedly, and this is how people learn, and this is the correct way because everybody's doing it. And whether it's K-5 or university, this is the structure. But what you're saying, it sounds like that's not that was a deliberate model that was adopted to kind of dull people down and make them more cogs in a wheel instead of free functioning agents, I guess you could say.
Yeah, and there's much more to that, and I'm not going to be able to fully elaborate on that. But just one more comment on education. I homeschool my son, and he's 10 years old. He is super far ahead in some areas, and then in other areas he would be considered behind. Like, he's taught himself coding in several coding languages and all kinds of stuff that I'm like, he's doing. I don't even know where he's doing all this himself. He's working with electronic components, and working with several online systems for animation and various things, that he's completely figuring it out himself, watching YouTube tutorials and whatnot. And then his handwriting is like his kindergarten handwriting. And we've just now started, like, in the last fourth grade homeschool, the last half of fourth grade, where he'll actually write and write stories. I couldn't get him to write. So, if he's in a regular school, he's going to feel dumb because his writing is way behind. And then he'd be bored out of his mind because he's wanting to do all this higher level stuff. He built his own website. He's put products up for sale, selling rocks and crystals. And then, doing all this other entrepreneurial type stuff.
And that kind of stuff in education is like stifle. You're discouraged almost from doing stuff like that. And
then it's even worse for boys. So I did well in the factory school model because I was a people pleasing girl, and I wanted to please my teachers. And but the boys, especially I'm
the exact opposite.
Well, I'm not a people pleaser anymore, thankfully, but I was when I was a kid. But the boys, my son is anything but a people pleaser. He wants to do what he wants to do, and he has a vision for what he wants to do. Yep. And I do require him to learn the basics, for spelling and various other things. I'm not like an unschooling homeschool mom, but he's free. He has most of his day to develop his specific interests. And I think he's going to be much better off for that and not stuck in this box. The other thing that the factory schooling does is it instills in the students, and I believe this is another crucial part of it, a certain view of the government, a certain view of the institutions, that the institutions and the people in charge of them know best. There's kind of that. That's also kind of drilled into you, whether not explicitly, then just by virtue of sitting in this room for most of your.
Don't ask too many questions, right? I remember I went to a University of Wisconsin. I'm from Wisconsin, and I went to one of their state schools. UW has their main campus in Madison, and then they have all these other kind of offshoots of the University of Wisconsin system. I went to one of those schools for a few years, and my first year in one of the general ed classes that everybody has to take, it wasn't anything politically motivated. It was a class about the history of art or something like that. It's like a class everyone was required to take, and this professor that I had would go on and on and on about. This was, during the first Trump election, when all that was heating up, and everybody was all about Bernie and the college system when he first became popular. And I just remember him going on and on about weird political things, and he was talking about socialism a lot, and he was how it's a good thing, and he would talk about moral relativism and how there's no absolutes and this and that. He just outright saying this stuff to the class. And it was completely irrelevant to the text that we were supposed to be studying and reading in this class. And I was just sitting there because I grew up going to Christian schools my whole life, and I never really experienced that. That was a shock for me, and I was like, "What in the world?" And I would rate like I was, it was a class of 150 people. It was a big, pretty big college class, and I would be the only one in the class that would raise my hand and be like, "What did you just say?" and start asking questions. And it got to the point where the professor called me up in front of the class to try and debate him about moral relativism. It was this whole thing. And after that, I was like, I can't be a part of this anymore. This is absurd. This is like, why am I paying for this? Is this really what's going on in education at this level? What's happening at kindergarten? What's happening at, whatever. I'm thankful enough to be able to go to a Christian school that was, maybe they still adopted some of those same standard procedures that we're talking about here as far as how they set up education, but it was a lot more free form than what I experienced in public education. You were allowed to ask questions about anything. You were allowed to challenge viewpoints. You were allowed to, you know what I mean? It was a lot more grounded in truth. They wanted you to learn how to think, and and there's obviously, it's not perfect, but I didn't experience that in public education at the university level at all, not even close. And it's sad to watch. It really is.
Yeah. And going back to, like, you already interviewed James Lindsay, like a lot of his work on the Marxification of education, it was really the universities that went towards socialism first.
Yeah.
And then, and then this other angle of infiltration of the schools, and then the teachers in the colleges of education. By I think he said it was by the mid 90s or so that most of the colleges of education were captured with this Marxification framework that has turned into what we now know as woke, and that's a whole other angle. So so the universities are worse in general than K through 12.
The thing that shocked me, kind of to your point, was how nobody else in that class I was just talking about was willing to ask questions. Nobody. And everybody, like, I knew there's other people there that thought this stuff was insane. In a class of 150 people, where the professor's up there saying there's no such thing as absolute truth, just verbatim saying things like that, there's got to be someone else in there that's an adult. We're all adults in that college class, that's smart enough and wise enough to hear that and think that's not true. But the fact that nobody else questions it, I don't get that. I don't get how that can be the case. Like, it just goes to show how effective, I guess, this cog in a wheel education is to really dulling people down and getting them to not think for themselves, not question anything. Even the most insane, asinine statements like that. They'll just sit there and, okay. Like, it's just, it's frustrating. But anyways, continue what you were saying. Sorry for this.
Yeah, I mean, so just a quick side note, and I'm having my home, I have a home inspection right now.
Yeah.
That the guy rang the doorbell and I asked them not to come until after 10. So anyways, hopefully I won't get disturbed in here.
Yeah, no, you're good. You're good.
So that's just something that's about to happen. But but back to, like, college. I had friends that took, like, different psychology and different, like, sociology classes and stuff in college, and they would have professors that would do that. I didn't have that experience. I actually kind of had the opposite. I studied biology for my undergrad, and the head of the biology department, I went to Florida State at the time, and he taught the evolution class we had to take. He actually got up at the front and said, it is pretty much completely mathematically improbable that macroevolution occurred, where there's evolution between species. Like, that mathematically doesn't work. And so that was kind of my experience with that.
Wow.
He was a Christian. He said divine, like a creation, like intelligent design is much more probable. But yeah, most people don't have that experience. So
no. I mean, you're trained to be a robot, essentially, is what I saw in public education at the university level. I saw a bunch of students that were sitting next to me that were raised in this public education that you're discussing here. And they were the result of me seeing a professor say something as insane as what he was saying, and then everybody just sat there and nodded along or didn't say anything. That cog in a wheel, that robot. We're not going to question the master in front of the class. This is years and years and years of public education prior that's trained them to be this way. And so this, what you're saying essentially is this is the goal of this communist style education, is to create robots so that we're not thinking for ourselves. We're not questioning narratives. We're not questioning authority, because in order for the communist system to work, there has to be this rigid authority that we're all subject to, in a sense.
And then back to your question about the Department of Education, things got much worse. If you look at the works of Charlotte Iserby, who was a whistleblower, she was Reagan appointed her to the Department of Education in his first term. And it was her job to help dismantle it, which didn't end up happening, obviously. But she had access to all the files, and Bill Gates was involved as far back as 1979, at the very beginnings of the Department of Education, to set up a one computerized curriculum for the entire populace to be able to groom the whole populace to have a singular ideology, and to be able to groom the whole views of the whole populace, and also to use the stimulus and response robotic training using computers. And anyone who's looked into the computerized curricula that they use for kids right now, it is horrible. Like it's clicking on the buttons, you're getting the dopamine hit because you click the right box. How much learning is actually taking place? Probably not much. And then you have the aspect of, like, children do not have a filter. They just generally, they'll accept what's told to them. But when it's in a video format, that actually even bypasses, it goes right. It's in the right side of the brain, bypassing logic more, making it that much harder for the kids to even be able to question.
Yeah.
What's being presented to them.
Right. Yeah. And so, going back to the way that this education system is set up, translating it from how the Soviets, managed their education. What are the parallels between exactly what the Soviets did and then kind of what we're seeing today? What are those overlaps?
Yeah, I think you look at, James Lindsay's work that he's done exposing the Paulo Freire, the Brazilian Marxist, and his whole method of turning education not into, we're giving you the basics to educate you, but turning it into a chance to indoctrinate the populace into Marxist ideologies, into oppressed versus oppressor, and to cause the oppressed people to rise up, to tear down the systems of oppression, to radicalize. That is also what the Soviet education did. Even the woman, the Russian woman I interviewed for my film, she was actually a friend of mine even before. She was telling me that, like, when she was in high school in the Soviet Union, even so far, like, they had a weapons class where they had to, like, take apart and clean and put back together their semi-automatic weapon in preparation for war with America, and that was what it was for. They were training them in militant tactics, and it was a required class to graduate from high school in the Soviet Union when she was in high school. And the kids are very heavily indoctrinated all throughout in the Soviet Union of this struggle, the communist struggle, and how the Soviet Union is the best. And of course you can argue, but in America we talk that America is the best. However, the American system is superior. The freedoms are vastly superior to its enslavement of communism. But using the education as this opportunity to drill in the Marxist-Leninist communism, to extricate. So the Christian kids were subject to beatings and mockery and various things in the Soviet Union. It's not maybe to that extreme in America, but there are parallels. You have to have the right views and the right ideology, which today it's the woke ideology. And if you're a kid and you're, like, raising your hand saying, sorry, there's two genders, in a lot of classrooms in America, that will get you in hot water.
Oh yeah, I mean that class the professor I was telling you about before, he emailed me. This was after he tried to get me to debate him in front of the class. It was this whole thing. Back then I wasn't smart enough to record any of this, and I didn't really have social media, and I wasn't doing anything like this, so there wasn't any. I wish I was, because I think it would have been a good story, but he sent me an email after all this saying, if you don't stop provoking the other kids in the class, it'll reflect on your grade, is what he told me. And I literally sent this email, copied and pasted it to the college administration, never heard back. And they didn't do anything about it.
Okay, another aspect of communism, like the communist takeover of education, and we're gonna look at China, and we're gonna talk about how in China, because again, communism, it's like a cancer. It mutates. It goes into different societies, and it might retain some similar things, and then it gets its own new set of characteristics. In China, they perfected this, and I don't remember the exact word for it, but where you had your file basically, and the teacher was having to report, does this child have the right views? Is there any, instances of this child, maybe asking the wrong questions or having the wrong views? And then the kids even would have to have their own journal where they're ratting on themselves if they have wrong think. And this would be part of the permanent file. So if you had wrong think in first grade, that could affect you getting a job or even getting into college later on. Well, how this connects with America today is the metadata. Well, so this computerized curricula, all that metadata is being recorded, and now with AI, that can all be analyzed. And now we have the social and emotional learning, where they're grooming the correct views socially and emotionally. And look, social and emotional
will affect your grade. Yeah.
Yeah, but not only that, it could impact your ability to get a job later. Let's say you don't have the right kind of empathy.
Right.
You don't have the right empathy, the right kind of woke empathy, where you don't have the right diversity, equity, and inclusion mindset, which is what social and emotional learning is designed to do, is to groom children to delete whatever ideology they previously had, whether it was Christian, from Americanism or whatever, and insert DEI as their new foundational ideology. They're doing this to school kids in most of the schools all across the country right now. No one's stopping it. And they might not use the words diversity, equity, and inclusion quite as much in some states because they have to call it different things now, but it's still the same thing going on. If your kid or you as a child don't uptake those views, and when you're clicking on the things and you're answering the surveys and the data collection, you have a wrong think, that could, if this system is allowed to continue to where it's designed to go, that will impact the ability of those kids to be able to get certain jobs.
Totally. I mean, even just the grade aspect alone, if you don't pass the class, you don't get the diploma. And if you don't get to the diploma, there's a lot of jobs that you cannot apply for that you're, striving to get. And so it's a way of intimidation. They're literally threatening your future. You could say that professor that did that to me, and I'm sure I'm one of many, many cases that's happened to in public education, especially in university. They're threatening your future. They're saying, if you don't shut up and let me indoctrinate everybody and wash everybody's preconceived ideas of what they believe, you're going to struggle to get a job. Your future is going to be on the line. That's what he's saying, essentially. I mean, that's sinister. That was my first semester freshman year of college, and I just remember sitting there thinking, is this what's been going on in public education this whole time? Is this really what's happening? And it was just like this light bulb moment for me. That's really when I started to get involved with politics in any sort of meaningful way. That's when I started to read. Maybe a year or two after that, it's when I heard about James Lindsay and started listening to some of the things he was saying. And it's just insane how this has progressed to this level, and they have so much control over the population. And then you hear stories of, people going to college and they're conservatives and they're Christians, and they go to college and then they come out and they're not Christians anymore. And there's this huge turnover rate, and they hate their family afterwards. And they have this, if you're a woman, you have this grievance against men, and they shave their head. This is why I think it's because it started with, it started with this robotic mindset in elementary school and in grade school and all of this that's led to, by the time they get to university, then they can turn on the indoctrination high speed and they'll just go right along with it. They've been trained
Yeah.
to go right along with it.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
young college undergrads are vulnerable. A lot. It's a very vulnerable time for a lot of young people,
Yes.
to be
Right.
out on their own for the first time and trying to figure out this world. And we're very impressionable, even still at that age. And it is a time that people get pushed to the left. And I was pushed to the left a little bit in college, but my graduate education ironically pushed me back more conservative, with my anti-com, like, I had a communist, a former Soviet dissident who was my major professor for my Russian literature, language and
Yeah.
literature degree. And boy, did she tell us some crazy stories. So, and we read the literature of the Gulag and the dissident literature of the Soviet Union, which was just absolutely horrific. So that pushed me, away from leftism. But yeah, even in a best case scenario, college for the last several decades has been pushing people to the left. And James Lindsay makes this point in my film. Where did the radicals, the 60s radicals, go? The ones that were like the Weather Underground and these various terrorist groups, and the ones like, marching in the streets, that when they tried to launch a socialist revolution in America, where did they all go? They all went into education. So
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's even the Frankfurt School, when they fled from Germany, where did they end up? They ended up in Ivy League schools across the country. And I mean, this is, I think, this repeated pattern of a lot of the crazy political stuff that we're seeing today, the people rioting and throwing bricks in windows because of BLM and all the trans stuff and the LGBTQ mafia and whatever it is, the open border stuff, all these riots in LA. I think all of this is just the fruits of this tree of education that has sprouted into this, utter communist style insanity, this revolutionary fervor that you were saying they're trying to provoke in people, in a
and it's
sense.
just one part of it. The five
Yep.
institutions that Antonio Gramsci specified had to be infiltrated: education, the churches, the religion, the family, the media, including young media for little kids even, and then the legal system. But the media is certainly playing its part. And then
Totally.
the
Yeah.
dissolution and weaker families is playing its part. It's all working together. This has all been done on purpose. It's been happening for most of us listening to this for our entire lifetimes, so
Oh, you break down the family. I mean, what is that going to lead to? It's going to lead to a sense of distrust and chaos in the home and chaos in your own life, emotional disorder, these things with kids. And then you send them to a government indoctrination camp or public education, and they're being told that they're oppressed and that they're actually animals and they don't have a creator that loves them and cares for them, and they don't have a higher purpose of any kind. And they're being taught to be victims on top of that. And then you sit them in front of a TV after school and they're being told the exact same thing from whatever movies or TV shows or news that's on. And of course it's going to lead to, all of this insanity that we're experiencing today.
yeah, one more thing about the family I want to say. In the Soviet Union, they did an experiment in the 20s
Yeah.
abolishing the family, and it was an
Great
abject
experiment.
failure.
Sure.
It was they would go into the communist revolutionaries would go into the countryside and tell the young peasant boys and girls, "Hey, we're not doing marriage anymore. Just go sleep around just go have fun. And if there's any babies, that when the babies come, hand them over to the state and the state will raise them." And it turned into it was a disaster. The state could not manage all of these children,
Yeah.
and it was causing their society to unravel. So they had to get the family back. So that the Soviet Union actually, for most of its existence, was very it was very pro-family, because the state just can't raise all those kids. So, but in a society that is targeted for destruction, yes, they will hardcore go after the family. One more aspect, and this is not something I talk about in my book or my film, but it's a really important aspect of it, is the destabilization, I believe this is really important, the destabilization of a society through destroying the health of the populace.
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
not just the mental health, but the physical health. And that's a whole other aspect that I believe is also a purposeful, even though most doctors are not knowingly trying to harm people, this whole system, which the Rockefellers also had their hand in molding medicine the way they did, because in the whole system of pharmaceuticals, which are made from petroleum byproducts, and who produced the petroleum? Oh, the Rockefellers. It was another income stream for them to
Yeah.
turn their petroleum byproducts into something that they could make money off of and control the populace more at the same time, and also harm the health of the populace over the long term. That's a whole aspect. And so these kids today,
Create the
so
virus and then sell the antivirus. Yeah.
absolutely, the whole
Yeah.
COVID thing is one aspect, but like, look, these kids, the high autism rate, the high mental health problems, these kids have been poisoned. And that's a whole other bandwagon of mine that's not even part of the book, but I would talk about that for hours as well.
Maybe a book 2.0, and go and all that. So
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, all this stuff. It's sad to watch our society turn into this. I mean, especially. I was going to ask you this today. How recently were you in the Soviet Union again? Was it?
Well, Russia. I haven't been
Oh
there.
yeah,
It's
sorry,
been,
Russia. Yeah.
yeah, I was there. I was a missionary there in 1997 and 98. And then I went back for a visit in 2000, 2001, and then I did a study abroad there and research for my thesis in 2002. So it's been over 20 years since I've been to Russia.
Okay, because I was going to ask, what's different now? Now that the Soviet Union has fallen and they've, at least in some sense, escaped this. What's different? Like, what's the attitude of the people there as far as communism goes? As far as the history of the Soviet Union, do they still look fondly on it, or are they still kind of working out of that indoctrination, or is it kind of like the light's been turned on and people are like, oh, this is horrible, we're not going to go back to this? Is it this never again kind of attitude, or what's the sentiment within the people, if you had to guess?
There's always been an element that has longingly wanted to return to communism. When I was there, even, there were a lot of older people that were like, oh, things were so much better with communism. Well, also, I was there during a very destabilized time in Russia.
Yeah.
And even there was a devaluation of the ruble while I was there, which caused a massive economic.
I know there's a lot of economic issues right after the fall. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So there was a lot of crime, drugs, heroin poured into Russia. All of this new media that people had never seen before poured in, and it was a very difficult time for Russia in the 90s. So yeah, a lot of people I talked to wanted to go back to communism, but even still today, there's elements that look fondly even upon Stalin. But then also, last time I was in Russia and last time I went to Red Square, or it was close to Red Square, where Stalin's grave, and I saw a Russian man spitting on Stalin's grave. Literally, he walked past it and just spat on it. So it's a mixed bag. And then Russia today, more than 20 years since I've been there, is even a whole other thing. And I don't feel qualified to completely comment. I have friends there,
Right.
but in some ways, life is a lot better in Russia right now for the average person. But then, of course, there's that horrible war. That's a whole other thing that we don't have time to get into.
Yeah.
It's a mixed bag.
Well, according to Tucker Carlson, Russia's the greatest place, and we should all move there, and they're way better than the United States. And
he went into one of the fancy subway. The subway stations that he filmed that in was built by Gulag prisoners, and built by forced labor of political prisoners.
Yeah. Yes. That whole interview Tucker did over there reminded me. There's this movie. It's kind of a raunchy movie. It's with James Franco, where he goes and interviews the dictator of North Korea, and his job is to make it look like North Korea is this wonderful place. And then there's all these like fake restaurants and fake grocery stores, and it looks all nice and like what they're filming. But then they'll like turn off the cameras, and it's just homeless people and people fighting and chaos, and everything's dark.
People eating cockroaches because they can't find anything else to eat.
Yeah, and that's kind of what it reminded me of. Was like Tucker's there in this fancy subway saying, "Look at how wonderful it is," and like, oh, what's the history behind this? What's actually going on outside? What's the government doing? And
And
I
then you
don't.
can always find, look, I love traveling and I love going to other
Yeah,
countries, and you can find something in any country that's like really cool. And I love so
totally.
much. I love the people of Russia. There's a lot of things about Russia that I loved. There's a lot of crazy, crazy stuff that I saw and experienced in Russia too. So definitely prefer living in America, but there's good stuff everywhere too. So,
Yeah,
but he was just focusing on one angle and
right.
neglecting to mention lots of other things.
Yeah. So as far as so you have that book, Beneath Sheep's Clothing. You have
Yeah.
the movie Beneath Sheep's Clothing. Where can people pick this up, find it? I would highly recommend. I'd like I was saying before we started, I've watched about a little over half of that documentary. I'm hoping to order your book here soon as well. Where can people find this stuff? Where can they access it and all that? And where can people find you on social media?
Yeah, people should go to beneathsheepsclothing.movie, and you can stream Beneath Sheep's Clothing online, and it's also buy DVDs for people who are older fogies who have DVD players still.
Yeah.
And there's also a link to get the book. Books on Amazon. It's paperback, ebook, or audiobook. And I'm actually about to put out, I'm not sure when you're putting this out, I have a new trailer for Beneath Sheep's Clothing that I'm excited to share. And as much as I'm not happy that a lot of crazy things have been happening lately in our country, I do think that maybe people are a little less complacent and maybe more willing to take a look at the history of how we've gotten to where we've gotten with this communist takeover of culture. And I hope people will watch and share Beneath Sheep's Clothing. Um, it's really a must watch for Christians, for parents of K through 12 students, grandparents of K through
Totally.
12 students, and just patriots in general. And I learned so much stuff that I didn't even know from my book, just interviewing the people that I interviewed: James Lindsay, Trevor Loudon, Alex Newman, Lisa Logan, Michael O'Fallon, and several others. Just highly recommend it.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate all the work you're doing. I mean, this is super important stuff. I know, like my mom, for example, I have a 15-year-old sister, and she's been homeschooling her the whole time, and my mom talks about all this kind of stuff a lot. And I think COVID especially was a big wake up call for not only my family but a lot of other people, and we're kind of that where people saw the fruits of how disastrous education has in this communist infiltration in a way that I think we've never seen before, at least in the United States. And
Yes.
I'm hoping people wake up and reject this. And if they have to, like, homeschool your kids, if you're watching this, homeschool your kids if you can manage it. It's so much better at this point than. And
And
I'm
let me
saying that
just,
as someone who used to make fun of. I bought into that, this like making fun of homeschool thing back when I was in school. But I'm like, I I mean, you can't avoid this stuff. You can't avoid how toxic public education has become. Um,
I just have to say this. I'm homeschooling my child, even though I shouldn't be. I'm a single mom, and I thankfully I'm able to work from home. There's people who are single parents, people who are abjectly poor. You don't need very much money to homeschool, even with a public library. There's still good books in the library, even though there's a lot of crazy stuff. There's tons of free resources online,
yeah,
tons of people who in your local area who can walk you through it. I would say homeschool your kids like their life depends on it. And people who think, oh, my kid's going to miss out. There's lots of things now. My son is going to be able to be, and he's interested in music. He's going to be able to be in orchestra and band, and still be connected with that, and still homeschool. Kids in lots of places they can play sports still, or there's homeschool groups where in specific areas where they have like a homeschool orchestra or different sports leagues. There's so much now because so many people have seen the light. I would say homeschool your kids, like unless you have some other kind of alternative education system, get your kids out of the regular schools like their life depends on it.
yeah, that's good advice. Well, I appreciate you for taking the time to do this. I'll link your website and all of that and book in the description here for people to check out. Highly recommend doing so for everybody, especially again if you're a parent and you're trying to figure out what to do with your kids as far as their education goes. So it's definitely worth the watch and all that. So I appreciate you, Julie, for taking the time.
Thanks so much. Appreciate it.